caring for our environment.
Hi, glad you could join us. I'm
I'd like to call to order the Malibu City Council special meeting of March 12th, 2020. May I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Mullen?
Here.
Councilmember Peak?
In the house, coronavirus free.
Councilmember Wagner?
Solid copy.
Mayor Pro Tem Pearson?
I'm just here.
Mayor Fair?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Light crowd. Doug Stewart, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? May I have an approval of the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And Kelsey, may I please have a report on the posting of the agenda?
The agenda for this meeting was properly posted on March 10th, 2020.
Thank you. May we have a staff report, please?
Sure. Let me, good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Let me just say a few words while the demographer gets ready for his presentation. So, first of all, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is that the coronavirus is a serious threat, and government agencies across the country, and certainly in the state, and including Malibu, are taking a number of measures to try and flatten the curve, as we've all heard and seen, by encouraging social distancing and eliminating the amount of time and instances where we are all brought together. So in furtherance of that, we are actually going to cancel tomorrow's meeting. That was a duplicate of tonight on the west side. And I'm sorry about that, because we had set this up so that we would have some people on this side of town and then another one on the other side of town. But that does not, the desire for that simply doesn't outweigh the threat that we're facing. So we're going to cancel that meeting. Tonight, everybody seems to be skipping a chair in between you, by and large, so we encourage all of you to practice good behavior, and wash your hands for 20 seconds and use sanitizer, and thank you for coming out. But we also decided to go ahead with the meeting because the demographer will be giving a presentation, and that will be able to be recorded, and then we'll put it online, and then we'll be able to show it to a broader audience in Malibu, and we're coming up with ways to make sure people know that that's possible, and encouraging people to make comments on the maps online. We've already begun to get a lot of emails and comments. Those will all be taken into account, so it's not necessary to come to the meeting in order to do that. So that said, the impetus for this discussion was the threat of litigation. We all know that, and that litigation over the California Voting Rights Act. But this conversation, especially this meeting tonight, isn't really about that at all. When the California Voting Rights Act has a very low bar for when there's a violation, and I don't think that Malibu is below that bar. I think we have some excellent defenses. But there's an interesting thing, the most interesting thing I think about the California Voting Rights Act is that it so favors districts as a solution to the access to elections that it actually empowers this council to, on its own, without ever going to the people, adopt district-based elections and change the way that your residents are represented on the council. And that is a very significant thing. And when we started as a group talking about that authority, we realized that the same way that you would decide to do it, you would also be deciding not to do it, one way or the other. And it is an important discussion. It's an interesting way of being represented. More and more cities and districts in California are going to district elections. There are pros and cons to it, and if we go forward with this and put it on a ballot in November, there'll be a campaign and an opportunity for proponents and opponents of that idea to hash it out in the true American spirit. But before we get that far into the conversation, we have tonight's meeting where we kind of are asking people to suspend their disbelief about whether we should have district elections and transport themselves into the theoretical world where districts are going to happen. And if they were going to happen, what would those districts look like? What kind of districts would we want to have? And that is where the demographer comes in. There are, and he will talk about this, a number of criteria that have to be met. And then there are the comments that we've been receiving at public hearings for the last couple of months. So taking all that into account, we have some draft maps. What we're soliciting now are comments on those draft maps. And then when we're done, we're going to publish what is going to be conceptual maps. And the reason that they never get to be final is that, one, we don't have district elections, so that question is going to come up next. And secondly, even if we did, the law requires us to redraw the maps in accordance with a census, and guess what? We're having a census this year. So whatever maps we come up with now would have to be relooked at for after the census figures. So this is a kind of a strange legal posture that we all find ourselves in tonight, looking to make comments on maps with the assumption that we are going to have district elections, but that doesn't mean that we will. That question's later. So with that long explanation, let me turn this over to the city's demographer to introduce himself and the work that he's doing.
Good evening. My name is Dave Ely. I have been doing district drawing for lots of jurisdictions since I was an undergraduate at Caltech, working on a couple of lawsuits with the city of Los Angeles and with the Justice Department. I've probably done 70 or so of these processes. In addition to being an expert in many court cases, both under the Federal Voting Rights Act and under the California Voting Rights Act. My presentation is going to talk about this process. So the first thing that we have is the schedule and the process. We're partway through the process already. You've had the first hearings, which are required. The process is required by the state law is that you have 2 hearings before any maps are generated, and then at least 2 hearings after maps are generated, each of them with at least 7 days after particular drafts that you're discussing are done. So you've had those first 2 hearings. I created some drafts that were put onto the city's website and made available to the public a week ago. And so we have met the requirements to have discussions about these maps today. The next hearing is currently scheduled for April 2nd. In order to use that meeting to be able to discuss new drafts, I will need to be able to produce drafts for that discussion by March 26th. And because of that, I'm asking that members of the public get whatever comments or suggestions or things by March 19th, so a week from today, if they want me to have them incorporated in what we do for that meeting. And then there's another meeting that's scheduled for April 13th that might be one where a decision is made about all of this. All right, this slide is a general description of what goes into redistricting. We have legal requirements that we have to meet, and then there's a lot of things that that become part of the analysis going forward. So we look at the geography of the jurisdiction. We look at neighborhoods, either neighborhoods that are just recognized by the people who live there, or neighborhoods that are officially defined. We also look at the physical layout of the city, so in the streets and highways, any kinds of barriers that we have. And so in the city of Malibu, you have a very pronounced structure to the geography, with a lot of, with PCH sort of being a spine, and a lot of neighborhoods connecting in different ways to that. And so that it has a very strong impact on the way that the districts are drawn. Then sometimes we also look at other kinds of jurisdictions which are overlapping this jurisdiction. So school districts or things like that. In this case, the whole city is in one school district, and the school board isn't elected by district. So that's not particularly relevant here. Sometimes we look at political participation, especially in situations where you have a minority community or a community that is sort of disadvantaged socioeconomically relative to the rest of the city. And I don't think that in a city like Malibu it will be a very important part of this analysis, but sometimes it is. We also look at the demographic characteristics. So we might look at how the population and the voting age population are broken down by ethnicity, and also how the citizen voting age population is broken down by ethnicity. For issues of the Federal Voting Rights Act, the citizen voting age population by ethnicity is critical. In the situation here, the minority populations are small enough that there's no districts that could be drawn that would lead to any sort of liability relative to the Federal Voting Rights Act. So we don't really need to worry about that particularly here. Sometimes we look at the socioeconomic characteristics of different neighborhoods, so income and home ownership and age of housing and length of residence. And I have that kind of data available to look at for the city. I don't believe that it's really necessary in this city, but if I'm instructed to consider it, I can't do that. And then, of course, what this meeting is for, public input, is a critical part of this entire process, and really directs how the focus is done on everything else. So the legal requirements that we have, the federal requirements, there's basically three main rules. The first, and really the only absolute one, is that the districts need to be as equal as practical based on the total population. As equal as practical is generally interpreted to mean the least populous district has to be within 10% of the population of the most populous district, so no more than a 10% deviation. Typically, we try and look at plus or minus 5%, but sometimes you can have a situation where one district is 2% away and another district is 8% away, the opposite direction. So it isn't necessarily plus or minus 5%, but that's sort of the general idea. And that needs to be based on the most recent census. Obviously, the most recent census right now is a long time ago, and it's also probably been greatly affected by the fires and the status of rebuilding afterwards here. But it's still the data that we need to use as our benchmark in this particular process. We will be trying to look at some data about structures destroyed in the fires and rebuilding permits and those kind of things. But there's probably not very much that we can do in terms of adjusting the populations that way. So all of my drafts and all of the things that I'm working on are based on the 2010 census population. And so that's why, obviously, anything that is determined now will have to be redrawn next year. when the new census data comes out. The other two issues, which are quite related to each other, you have to respect minority voting rights, and that means you can't do anything. You can't intentionally discriminate against minorities, but you also can't do it accidentally. So you can't draw districts in a way that result in vote dilution. Again, like I said, the minority populations here are small enough that you're not at any risk of violating the Federal Voting Rights Act. The equal protection rules say that you can't draw districts just based on race, with the assumption that people of different races have different interests, and just drawing districts purely because of that. Obviously, we're not going to do that here. State law is a little more complicated, and actually, in the particular process that we're in, we're not really covered by what is a new legal requirement that was just instituted. But we're going to go forward with this process as if we were governed by that, because you will be when it has to be redrawn. And so basically we have the first two requirements are basically the same as the federal requirements. You have to comply with the federal rules, and you have to have equal population. And then the state specifies, and I believe that there's a printout that has the section from the election code in more detail, but they specify sort of a set of priorities. So the districts have to be geographically contiguous. So any part of a district has to be connected to every other part of the district, and it can't be just at a single point. You need to minimize the division of neighborhoods or communities of interest. And the reason it's minimize and not just not do it is that neighborhoods and communities of interest are often large enough that it's impossible to reach the population requirements without dividing some neighborhoods. And so, we try to minimize them as much as possible and make whatever divisions are needed to be as logical as possible. Then we need to have easily identifiable boundaries, usually major streets. Sometimes in a situation like you have in Malibu, where the major streets are kind of isolated from each other and they have people living on both sides of them, it doesn't make too much sense in a lot of cases to put the boundary on a major street. So we try and identify a physical feature that separates communities. So if you have a river or a ridge line or those kinds of things, and that's what I've tried to do at least in a preliminary way in the drafts that I've done. And then districts are supposed to be geographically compact, which is defined as meaning that you don't bypass one population group in order to get a distant population group in a district. Again, sometimes what bypassing means is not entirely clear, and sometimes in order to to minimize division of neighborhoods, you have to sort of bypass those neighborhoods in order to get sufficient population in a district not dividing the neighborhoods. And there's some examples of that in the drafts that I have as well. And then the final rule is that the districts aren't allowed to be drawn in a way that discriminates against or it favors a political party. Wouldn't know how to begin doing that if I wanted to here, so we won't do that. The geographic considerations that I try and take into consideration, but more especially what I try to encourage people to give me input on, are defining specific neighborhoods that are recognized or communities of interest where people act together or have common interest, where it would make most sense to keep all of those groups of people together in a single district. And for those neighborhoods that aren't large enough to make an entire district, which neighborhoods have common interests, so it would make sense to keep them together in districts. And on the flip side, sometimes there's communities that are so distinct from each other that they would be uncomfortable together in a district. They have conflicting interests, and it would be hard for a single member to accurately represent both communities. And then we want to look at physical features, sort of like I was talking about before, the rivers or hillsides or anything that separates people that would be a good natural barrier or boundary between districts. And then the final thing is if we have significant points of significant landmarks within the city, things that are very important to the city or that are highly trafficked, that have a big impact on the neighborhoods around them. And sometimes those are important in how they're located within districts. All right, so I have four draft maps, which I'll discuss briefly and sort of try and tie them into how they're created based on these rules. So draft map 1, with this map I started at the western edge of the city, following PCH and picking up communities that were connected to PCH until I got to the population of a district. What I discovered was that moving along, District 1 does not have enough population without picking up some of Malibu Park or something else. And Malibu Park is obviously much too large to be able to fit with the rest of District 1. And so in this first draft, I connected the more inland parts of Malibu Park with the western district, and then the sort of the coastal areas of Malibu Park are connected with other communities that are on the northern side of PCH. I basically put the Point Dume area into a district by itself. It has just about the right population for a single district. And the separation between District 2 and District 4, that's one where I'm trying to use the backs of hillsides to separate, and unfortunately I don't have it in front of me right now, but to separate the communities that are connected on separate streets that come up from PCH. And then at the eastern end of the city, I have a line that's basically on the watershed that's there. It goes into Malibu Lagoon that separates the Serra communities from the communities to the west of that. And that line I've used in all four of the drafts because it's very difficult to see what alternative there would be without violating the compactness rules and bypassing a lot of population unnecessarily. In draft map 2, District 1 is the same as it was in draft map 1. This time I was keeping closer to the theory of following PCH east and putting in the communities that are connected by feeder roads to that. So District 2 has communities that are both north and south of PCH to the west, and then District 3 has communities north and south of PCH farther east, and then Districts 3 and 4 are the same as in draft 1. Yes. Sorry. So drafts 3 and 4 were created to try to maintain the Malibu Park community as whole as possible in a single district. And that required, in a sense, bypassing it to get population that was necessary to make District 1 have sufficient population. And so in this draft, it's bypassed over the mountains basically, and connects communities that are north of PCH, kind of in the center of the area above Point Doom. It's like Ramirez Canyon area, I think. And then the Point Doom area is divided in order to have enough population for District 2, and so then it balances the rest of its population similarly to what it did in Draft 2, going north of PCH on the western edge, on the eastern edge. In this draft, the line between District 3 and District 4 in the draft is actually on a street, so it would separate communities. And the reason for that is that I had difficulty meeting the population requirements without splitting additional geography, and so this was doing what worked, but I recognize that it's probably kind of problematic in that sense. But again, the districts 4 and 5 are in the eastern part are the same as they were in the others. And then for Draft 4, I'm connecting District 1 with the area, primarily the area, the mobile home park that's south of PCH and next to Zuma and Western Beach, to get sufficient population for District 1. And District 2 is entirely north of PCH, putting together Malibu Park and I think Ramirez Canyon communities. District 3 has the bulk of Point Doom and Paradise Cove. And then we've gone back to basically the same boundary that 1 and 2 had between Districts 4, or the western boundary of District 4. And again, Districts 4 and 5 are separated by the same boundary. So on the city's website, there's lots of information about this process, the documents that relate to things. It includes staff reports, the letter from the attorneys. I believe a copy of this presentation will be there, or is there. The schedule information is there. The draft maps. On this page, you can either link to the city's GIS, which has the drafts available to show there, or there are PDF files that can be downloaded and printed that are similar to what I showed on the screen. And then there's information about how the public can contact to submit their suggestions. And one thing that would be helpful to me if people are doing this is, to the extent that's possible, if people can be very specific about actual boundaries or suggestions of where boundaries could be moved to. So, downloading and printing some of those maps and then marking them up and sending them back in is probably a good way of doing that, in addition to any kind of descriptive things that people want to submit. I believe that's the end of my presentation. All right.
Thank you. I assume we have public speaker slips? Okay, the first public speaker is Lance Simmons, followed by Craig Hill with 4 minutes, followed by Doug Stewart.
Good evening, City Council, Mayor. I find it somewhat ironic that we're standing here in the midst of, one, a rainfall, two, an absolute public health disaster, and still trying to cope with the effects of the Woolsey fire, and we're talking about this. That is beyond irony as far as I can see. I'm not going to comment on the maps. I think you can draw the maps, basically. I think just about everybody knew what the maps were going to look like. I don't think you'll have a whole lot of variation there. But I cannot help but go back to what it is we, the city of Malibu, and you, the leadership in the city of Malibu, are accused of. And yes, you're being accused because you get the threat of a lawsuit. You're being accused of promoting the impairment, in quotes, the impairment of minority groups' ability to elect their preferred candidates or influence the outcome of elections, which occurs when the electorate votes in a racially polarized manner. I have spent my entire life devoted to the cause of helping vulnerable people and minorities. I will be the first in line to charge the Hill against such nonsense. And do you think that that's what we're doing here? Oh, I sincerely doubt it. Now, there was some discussion about the state bar being low. I've read the legislation. I've drafted plenty of legislation. The legislation is horribly drafted. Doesn't the federal law preempt the state law? Shouldn't we go with the higher bar? And you know, I kind of feel like we're hostages. We've been taken hostage, and we've been given the luxury of choosing our demise. Do we want to be shot, stabbed, hung, poisoned, or drowned? Take your pick. Thanks a lot. This is an unscrupulous and dishonest effort. In the legal profession, it's referred to as ambulance chasing. I have very little doubt that no matter what you do here, when we get into the system, if you go this way, you will probably end up being sued for gerrymandering down the line. Now, I love quotes, and there's a quote attributed to Alexander Hamilton. And it says, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. Don't fall for this. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Craig Hill. You have 4 minutes as long as Hashi Clark is here. Okay, thank you. And then Doug Stewart and Scott Dietrich.
Good evening, Council. I heard what you said, Attorney Hogan, about focusing on the maps, and I'll do that, but a few introductory remarks. I assumed that there'd be some great wisdom shared in the closed hearing, and I had no reason to question that, but when I finally looked at the CVRA and what it actually says, and I did the math, I'm surprised that anyone could think there was any chance that the city could be in violation of it. So I think that people deserve a better explanation as to why we didn't just do a spit take in the face of Mr. Grimes and Shankman, and why instead we're going through this costly charade. A violation under the CVRA requires, at minimum, 3 factors must be met, and I'm quoting from that. I won't go through them all here, but none of them can be met in Malibu. I'll just give you one. It says the protected class must be sufficiently large in number and geographically insular to comprise a voting majority within a proposed district. If you have 5 districts, that's 20% of the residents in each. To have a majority in at least one, you'd need over 10% Hispanic population in that district, but we have about 6% in the whole of Malibu, nor are they geographically insular. So the math just doesn't add up. Case closed. You needed that element. You need 3 more other elements. You can't meet any of them. Further, the Elections Code cites the Supreme Court ruling that council districts shall not be drawn with race as the predominant factor. On its face, that says that if you have districts already, you can't jigger the boundaries based on race. But it also says that if you don't already have districts, nor can you suddenly draw them with race in mind, except as subject to strict scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. We can't meet those three elements either, even if we wanted to draw boundaries based on race. We just heard from the demographer that, a quote here said that race and ethnicity won't be an important part of the analysis. So what's the rationale to do it at all if that's not the analysis? There really is none. So getting to the maps. Following the staff report, you must draw them also for 4 and 6 districts to allow for the possibility of an elected citywide mayor. That office would help keep the city unified if we had to be spread into districts. And it's possible that 4 or 6 districts would divide better among neighborhood lines as required. As it is, all 4 variations drawn of 5 districts would illegally bisect neighborhoods, notably Sycamore Canyon, and numbers 3 and 4 don't meet the requirements against gerrymandering. So you're really looking at 1 and 2, maybe. Also, the CVRA's community of interest requirement provides a rationale for treating beachside neighborhoods separately. Beach lots aren't required to meet TDSF standards or the second-story 2/3 rule. They have unique issues involving wave uprush, sea level rise, shoreline protection, parking, etc. So depending on whether you'd have 4, 5, or 6 districts, beach parcels might comprise 1 or 2 of them, with hillside districts spread from east to west. If the total number of districts was 4, maybe 1 of them would be beachside, adjusted up to 25%. If there were 6 districts, maybe you could get 2 out of on the beach side. So until you've done the demography on 4 and 6 districts in different versions that include and exclude beach districts, we can't know where the best boundaries would actually be drawn. Bottom line, there's no legal basis underlying this extortionate scam. None of the CVRA's required elements are even remotely applicable to Malibu. So we need to hear better why we're even here in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Doug Stewart, followed by Scott Dietrich, followed by John Mazza.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. First of all, I'm very much in favor of the city retaining its current at-large method of selecting council members. However, apparently the standard set by the state for determining voter discrimination appears to be so low, it's going to be impossible for us not to have to adopt the election by district approach. Secondly, I fully endorse the idea of placing the at-large district election to the voters. If nothing else, this will afford an educational and advisory opportunity to the residents of why this is being proposed. My only caveat is not to make this a one-way door that if not approved by the residents, then our only option is to fight a highly and likely losing and expensive legal battle. Please consider making this a two-way door where likely the next council will be able to make a balanced decision on what to do about the district voting rather than having their hands tied by anything other than an advisory ballot measure. Finally, as to voting districts, I realize that the equal population counts and natural boundaries are the criteria. However, in selecting one border option versus another, I would suggest that also balance the number of registered or active voters as a further criteria to provide a more equal representation within the districts. I know that was in the demographer's report, but he didn't emphasize it. Hopefully, as you're looking at one choice versus another, the number of voters might be a tiebreaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Scott Dietrich, followed by John Mazza, followed by Norm Haney.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. As you've noticed, there's not a large turnout tonight. And it's the same people that spoke last time on this issue. There is no support for this in this city to go district-wide elections. I think Christie, in her excellent explanation of how this process worked, said that the council, according to state law, could either decide on their own to go district or, contrarily, could decide against it. And I think that's what you should do. I don't even think it should go on the ballot. It's just a complete waste of money that, like I said, there's no support for dividing us up. And that's exactly what district would do, district elections would do. When you look at the various maps, I sympathize with our demographer that they look gerrymandered, as Lance said, that you're trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, and it's not working. But it's just frustrating. We're spending all this money. We know we don't meet the criteria to, no matter how you take and subdivide the city, you don't have the criteria to give even 10% in any one district of the protected class Hispanics. And I find it very insulting that Mr. Shankman, or is that Shakedown, said that, we're discriminating. We are not. That is not who we are. And if we go forward in this process, that's what we're admitting. And really, when you start to going into the weeds and you look at community interest, the real separation should be beach versus canyon. And then think about that. You'd have a map with this little skinny district along the beach. We in Malibu have a unity of interest. We all faced the same challenges. We faced fires, and we faced Pacific Coast Highway dangers, and we're trying to get our own school system back. So I just urge you to make the hard decision and say no to this. And if we have to fight a lawsuit, we fight the lawsuit. We will win that lawsuit. And last, I just have a question, maybe Reva knows. How often is the council chambers disinfected? Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker
All of City
is,
Hall is being disinfected multiple times throughout the day.
John Mazza, followed by Norm Haney, followed by Paul Grisanti.
I actually saw them disinfected. Thank you. I'm actually going to talk about the map. Number one, maps 2, 3, and 4 would cause a revolution, and you'd burn the city hall down if you tried to divide Point Doom in half. So forget those. That's a fact. So I'm concentrating on map number 1. And the demographer talked about several things, but one was minimizing division of neighborhoods. And what we've done is take an artificial barrier, Canaan Road, and say, gee, well, East Winding Way, West Winding Way, and Ramirez Canyon are different from everybody to the left of West Winding Road, Canaan. And they aren't. They're part of the Malibu hillside neighborhoods for Point Doom. And all of those streets have things in common. Now, so there's a solution to that, and that is that if you look at the map, they've taken the Paradise Cove Mobile Home Park and put it in District 4, okay? And then they've cut out the Ramirez Canyon neighborhood and the east side of Canaan, cut them out and put them in a district which the very next voters from that area are over 5 miles away. There's 4 condo units in between. The one at Corral Canyon on the beach. Nobody else. It's parkland. And Corral Canyon isn't in the city. So if you could take the mobile home park and put it in District 4, and that's approximately the same number of people who live in Ramirez and Winding Way. And you can move that boundary wherever it fits going east. But you could keep the rural areas of those mountains together and keep Ramirez Canyon, why do I have to talk fast, from being 5 miles from their neighbors, okay? The people they vote with totally different interests, with a totally different access to Malibu. They take Malibu Canyon, the Ramirez Canyon takes Canaan. It's a common interest. Now, there's a geographic requirement he talked about. You shouldn't have a neighborhood or a bifurcated neighborhood 5 miles from the next voter. It should not be that way. And geographic distances are one of the requirements that he talked about. And that is a fact. So if approximately at Latigo you could divide, and you're just talking parkland from there down to Puerco, it would make sense, and it wouldn't take the people of Ramirez Canyon and make them Civic Center residents. Thank you. And I've given you a map that shows that.
Thank you. Norm Haney, followed by Paul Grisanti, followed by Graham Clifford.
Good evening, Chair Farrer and council members. You know, I've been to most of the city council meetings over the past 29 years, and I have never seen a council member with a prejudice over the community that he comes from versus the rest of Malibu. What I have seen is every single council member seems to be accountable to every single area in Malibu and is able to balance the goals, objectives, and priorities and make good decisions that benefit everyone in Malibu. Lou Lamont comes to mind. He came from Big Rock, but he made many, many decisions that left Big Rock out of the priority because another area had a priority. And he didn't focus on Big Rock. Big Rock wasn't any more important to him than the rest of Malibu. I like the idea when city council members have to go to various communities and explain to them what it is they want to accomplish and learn from the residents what the residents think is important and carry that with them through their election process and their service on the city council. I want to thank all of you for your service. There's not a lot of people that know how much sacrifice you have to make. So I'm absolutely against districting. I want every city council member to be responsible to every citizen in Malibu, or people that own property in Malibu for that matter. Having said that, I think map number 1, along with John Maz's comments, that is where I would come from. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next is Paul Grisanti, followed by Graham Clifford, followed by Kevin Shankman.
Greetings, Mayor Farrer and City Council people. I am so pleased to be here yet again because I'm so confused about this whole thing. For instance, I'm wondering if someone can explain to me if the great stretches of the beach, which are held as weekend houses where the people all vote somewhere else, in the census, do they show up as empty? Are we counting them? I don't know the answer. And since we don't seem to have much of a differences based on ethnic groups, how about the differences based on political registration at those houses? Do we have that information available? Is there something happening here that I can't see other than the fact that we have a very poorly written law that is being treated as a piggy bank? And the next question is, if it's so obvious that we can beat this, how come nobody's beat it yet? Are we that much better than the other people they've taken to court so far? I mean, Santa Monica, I can't understand why they even appealed it. They have clearly defined areas where and a lot of population that, it could work. But I just don't see it for us. But have any of the other cities that have already lost had a similar situation to ours, or are we just they picked us to do because they feel like they can do everybody, and they'll be sure and get some publicity if they beat us. So, and I don't envy you your decision. And I think that one makes the most sense, but I'm not really crazy about any of them. Thank you. And I do hope we get some answers about what counts as a house. Thanks.
Thank you. The next speaker is Graham Clifford, followed by Kevin Shankman.
I'm looking forward to Mr. Shankman shedding some light on this lawsuit. However, I will restrict myself to the map here. And I agree with everyone else who's spoken, and I think that number one is the obvious choice, largely because of Point Dume. There's also a very minor thing that I would like to bring up, in that Zuma and Westwood Beach is stuck way up here, which is where it's not. But it also is mentioned, it also is listed where it should be. It must be a printing error of some description. It's way at the end, way at the left end of District 1. And I'd also like to give my version of why I think we have a low turnout at the previous meeting as well as this one, and that's because everybody believes that this is a foregone conclusion and there's nothing to discuss. And I've spoken to a lot of people who feel that the lawsuit is forcing us to do stuff that we don't want to do, that we don't need to do, because the population situation is meaningless as far as the law is concerned. And so they feel there's no need to come to the meetings. So I think if you somehow could publicize the meetings in a different light and stress the fact that there is a reason to come, that you'd get more people here. Now, I know the coronavirus hysteria is also playing into it, but I agree with Norm. I agree actually with pretty much what everybody said. I agree with Norm's thing about every council member representing our city as a whole. I've wavered between districting and not, but I think districting would maybe introduce more divisiveness in a funny kind of way, because then there would, in a district that didn't have a good candidate, you'd end up with a bad candidate. And so I think in the long run, I think that the way we're doing it now is the best. And I think we're such a small city anyway that I can talk to all of you about the east end of Malibu, and you all understand what I'm talking about. And I never have felt that the east end, I felt occasionally that the east end was dropping under the radar, especially with the Zuma Beach situation, but I found out that I was wrong. So I agree with Norm. I also agree with with the changes that John Mazza had to say as far as the map number 1 is concerned. And I also agreed with most of what Craig had to say, except I couldn't understand what the business about 4 or 6 districts. I didn't understand what that, I missed that importance. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kevin Shankman.
So much like the speaker 2 speakers ago, I don't know why Santa Monica is appealing either. I hope that this council is taking its legal advice from the city attorney regarding this matter, and not folks who come up here and pretend to be legal experts. I would also be happy, I've talked to some of you about the law concerning this matter. I'd be happy to answer any questions in public here, in private, in conversations. I'm always open to that. But I do want to sort of take the temperature down a little bit and respond to one comment about how you're being accused of something, accused of racial discrimination. That is absolutely not the case. The California Voting Rights Act explicitly says that an intent to discriminate is not an element of the claim. No one has accused you of such a thing, and I doubt that anyone will. With respect to the maps, I can say that I actually agree with John Mazza, which is something that I haven't been able to say in a while. I think District Map 1 is the better of the four. And I'd actually like to hear from Mr. Ely about Paradise Cove being part of District 2. Seems to make more sense as a matter of communities of interest that it be part of either District 3 or District 4, probably District 3, because it is part of Point Doom, that community. And the reasons why it, on Map 1, is part of District 2 nonetheless. I imagine it's probably has something to do with population equality, but there may be other ways to have Paradise Cove be maintained within that Point Doom. Again, if any of you would like to have a conversation about the law about this matter, I know you can always call Ms. Hogan, and you can call me as well, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions that have been spread about it. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any council comments? Or Christy?
You have a couple of things. One is that you don't have to make any comments. If you have comments about the maps, then I would encourage those because that's what we're taking notes on. In terms of the lawsuit, that's not what we're here for. And with respect to the ballot measure, that's something that we will have a chance to talk about. There was one very interesting comment made, which I don't want to discuss now, but I will definitely make sure is included in your staff reports that come about the ballot measure, and that is the idea of doing an advisory measure as opposed to a binding measure, because maybe that will assist you in having some flexibility after the decision gets made one way or another. So that was an interesting sort of addition to the conversation, which I wanted to note that I heard.
Okay, thank you. Rick, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, wanted to thank the demographer. This has got to be difficult for you coming into a town, that you're not that familiar with and slicing it up. And, thank you for your efforts. I appreciate that. Although I did note that you sliced my neighborhood in half in every one of these, but I'm just kidding. Some of that would be rectified somewhat by John Mazza's suggestions. So it's not easy, but I wanted to personally thank you very much for your efforts in undertaking a very difficult task, and we appreciate it, and for taking the time to explain everything to us also. And I also wanted to just thank everybody for coming down here on a very rainy night and under threat of maybe, contagious diseases, and coming and giving us your thoughts, whether they be in person or written. We listen to all of those, and I greatly appreciate everyone's comments about the maps and about your feelings on the subject. And that's really all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Anyone else?
I'll take a stab at it. I'm sticking mostly to the map decisions that are before us, and once again thanking the 10 speakers that came down this evening and spoke with some authority, and obviously with some research behind your comments, and I thank you for that. I guess we'll get into the Map 1 dissemination as we get into the conversations later this evening. Wanted to address one of the speakers, Craig Hill. Thank you for that dedication and the emails that you sent to council. It certainly enlightened me on to reasoning for when we put it on the ballot, that I hope some of those reasons are explained in the ballot measure when our city attorney drafts that language. I don't know if it's still 400 words or 600 words that are part of the explanation or pro or con, but you can clarify that. But some of his comments, I would think, reach out to the community as to why and how. And I'll like to hear from the other council members on their positions on the breakdown of Map 1, because it seems that that was one thing that everybody keyed on, and that's why we're here this evening. So thank you, Karen.
Ms. Jefferson, Schuyler.
Thank you, everybody, for coming here this evening. I would take a little bit of a different direction with it. I actually think that Map 2 is a little bit better, and my reasoning for that at this time is that I think it's important that each of the districts in this city both comprise people that are on the beach or on the bluff and have some element of mountainous terrain with them. And the reason, I think that's really what my reasoning is, and that's really the, you know, one of the maps that's on there that definitely does that. I think it's, I understand the comments about map number 1, but I think it would be, and you know, the last thing that I would want to do is split the community that I'm from, but I think that would be a wiser decision, and I think that'll get could get more stuff done in the future versus pitting a community against another community where then you wouldn't have any, you know, reason to be so much caring as what's going on in the mountains, and I think that's important. So that's what I think at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Skylar. Mikey?
Yep, thanks for everyone coming down, and I hope people are watching or will go view the tape and send in their comments. I know it's an awkward meeting on so many levels, so appreciate everyone's time and attention to this. I like your comments on map 2, except cutting Point Doom in half seems like that's a really strong neighborhood. So there's no great answers here. I think I definitely gravitate towards map 1 as well. I like John's comments. They were pretty astute. I think one thing I wouldn't do, and maybe it just wouldn't happen anyhow, is end up with both mobile home parks in one district. I think that would be a mistake, and I don't think that's being proposed at all, but that's close to happening there. But keeping Ramirez Canyon neighborhood, that is a very strong neighborhood together, makes sense. And I could see the possibility of moving District 4 a little bit east in order to making some adjustments to allow District 4 to be more of a central Malibu district than it is now, as maybe the way to cure the Ramirez Canyon issue. I know it's tricky. And I really like the comments on people that vote too. I don't know how much weight that has to be taken, but certainly when all of us ran for office, if we spent a little money and got some help, we found out where the voters were more than where the people were. So it's an interesting comment. I don't know how much weight it should carry, but I want to acknowledge that comment as well. And those are my comments, and thanks again to everyone coming down.
Thank you. For starters, I did wonder the same thing that Paul brought up about primary residence versus vacant homes, registered voters. I don't know if party affiliation has any weight in this, but that's something to think about. And I have a question. I don't know if Christy might have an answer. The 2020 census will further inform these maps, and when are those results reasonably expected?
I'm not sure when the results are expected, but the law requires that after each census that we relook at the maps to see shifts in population numbers. And so any district or city that is operating in districts has that regular 10-year reevaluation. Just make sure that you're not losing any representation.
Okay, thank you. I think as with most people, the map number 1 made the most sense to me. But I want to point out 2 things for anybody watching right now or who will be watching this going forward. Public comments need to be received by March 19th. That's 1 week from today. And the other thing is, when you do send your comments to us, please, I will quote, be as specific as possible. That helps us. Okay? And those are my comments.
That we're not going to be having the meeting tomorrow, so please spread the word about that, and that is only because of our response to the coronavirus.
Okay, yeah.
And I wanted to ask one last comment too. Not actually a last comment, just another comment. And it's interesting to hear your comments, Skylar, about the map number 2, especially as a Point Doom guy. because I figured the Point Doom guys are like, we're not splitting Point Doom. But you make a very good point, which is I do think that we are, mountains / canyons, and we're ocean. That's what the whole place is, and I think there's a lot of value in that. And in fact, when I look at my own neighborhood on that one, as much as I hear what John Mazza is saying about us being kind of more toward the Canaan stuff, actually we're more, strangely enough, in common with Winding Way and Sycamore Park. We're all united, with the conservancy issues. So I think for every neighborhood, there's going to be these little idiosyncrasies that for someone from the outside is very difficult to be able to pick up on. But it's unfortunate that it seems to be driven by the numbers, where it's got to be plus or minus 10%. And it's almost like the British carving up the Middle East after the First World War, and then, we're still having implications of those arbitrary borders many years later. But I did want to say that I see your wisdom in map number 2, and I think that actually works probably better than map number 1. So just to make sure that everybody out there understands, they should submit their comments online via email through the city's portal thing by the 19th, was it? Okay, so John Mazza probably should put that in an email also, everybody. I know you did public comment and all that. Oh, okay, never mind. Thank you, John. Okay, that's all I got.
One more further observation, which I don't have an answer for and concerns me. So we're going through this exercise to come up with maps that make sense, that people agree on. Go to an election. Let me see if I got this right. And then the census also hits, so we have to redo the maps, but we're going to be redoing maps based on a census after the Woolsey fire. So those maps are going to be entirely wrong to what the next 9 years after it represent. 2 homes are rebuilt right now. 2 homes, and only one of them is even being occupied at this point. So the Woolsey fire, we're talking about map 1 or 2, that's the area that got burned, and so many houses are missing. So we are doing a massive disservice ultimately by following the law here, it seems.
Well, please don't say that.
Well, I just mean, I don't mean legally, I mean in response to neighborhoods. We are talking about neighborhoods that have been decimated and lost hundreds of homes. So we're using demography here on Malibu Park, 175 homes burned down. So that's it. I'm just pointing that out.
No, let me just respond to that a little bit. Because it's not as dire as you make it sound, because there are a lot of factors.
But I want to be dramatic.
I'm sorry, they ruined that for you, but there are a lot of factors that go into making these decisions that, in fact, under the elections code, where you're registered to vote and where you can vote is where you intend to live, and a temporary displacement, especially in a situation like this, doesn't change that. And so as you heard, what the demographer's job is to look at a lot of factors in order to draw those districts. So, those things get accounted for. And, and it's odd because we're right on the eve of a census, but you got to see the wisdom in doing that, right? Because look at how this city has changed. I mean, the demographics of the city have changed even in the 29 years that I've been working for you, watching Point Doom, for example, explode with families, and then seeing the ways the different schools have opened and closed. And it's just been there's a lot of changes. So you can see that it's wise to go back and revisit this periodically.
So thank you. Thank you for calming my drama down. So that leads me to one more comment for the demographer. So right now, about half the homes that burned down have submitted paperwork to rebuild. About half. A whole bunch haven't approached the city at all. I think if I was to guess, 30% won't rebuild that were here, that are on the current census. And I don't know how that factors into the next sentence. A lot of land is just lying there that has people registered to it, but they have no idea what they're doing. So just to throw in an interesting twist, you probably don't see a lot in the 70-plus ones you've done, but yeah, just to make it more interesting when you're sitting up at 2 in the morning trying to figure out maps. I just thought I'd add that.
Thank you. I'll say two things based on the last few comments. I also live on Point Doom. I don't know if I'm necessarily convinced that map number 2 is the best one we've seen tonight. And I will say, I don't know if it has any bearing or if we have any information on how many people have changed their voter registration who lost their homes. But regardless, those lots are still zoned residential, whether they've been rebuilt or not. So I assume they will one day again be residences. Anybody else have any comments?
One more, thank you. A number of the speakers spoke about the needs and the process for this that's before you and before the rest of the voters of the city. And the council came up with this decision, I mentioned it once before at the last meeting, is that this council has always been about transparency. And I believe that is why we're going through this formal process to explain to the people who may defend us or may not defend us if we take this to court or not, depending on what they decide on the ballot. So this discussion needs to be maintained fresh, wholesome, and transparent, and I hope more people will comment onto the outcome of this and participate in the ballot in November and give us a direction. But I think transparency is here is why this council is doing it. And I think the city attorney will surmise that is our best and our behavior that a council should take. Easily, as was mentioned earlier in her broadcast about where we're headed, was that we could decide to do this without even involving the city, the voters. We could have made that decision. I'm stating something that you stated. But if we're going to put this on the ballot and then follow the decision of the voters, then I would like this to be that moment of transparency. And I mentioned it to Mr. Shankman, that that's how we do business in Malibu. And I hope we can hear more from our constituents and our voters, and don't let this fall behind something else. Please comment, get it in writing. You got another week left. We need to hear from everybody, or as many people who will get to us on that. Thank you.
Okay, does staff need any more direction? Okay. All right. I'd like to adjourn in in memory of Mr. William Poole. Bill Poole, I'm sure many of you know, was a long time woodshop teacher at Malibu High School, and he recently left this earth. So do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
A second?
Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Aye.
Thank you.